Welcome, everyone. Good morning from New York, good afternoon from London and Edinburgh, and good evening from Dubai and Baku. We are delighted to host this salon on culture and societal diplomacy in partnership with the Azerbaijan Tourism Board. I am April Gao, Global Policy Advisor at Broach Associates. Thank you for joining us on this UNESCO World Art Day to hear about the fascinating story of liberation and transformation of contemporary art in Azerbaijan. Culture, the arts, and humanities are undoubtedly man's highest achievements. They provide the greatest source of national identity, pride, and the feeling of belonging to a special place on this small planet. Art nurtures creativity, innovation, and cultural diversity. When artists and artistic freedom is supported, encouraged, and protected, art plays an important role in sharing knowledge and encouraging curiosity and dialogue. In this way, furthering the development of art also furthers our means to achieve a free and peaceful world. So today you will hear about how the emergence of artistic freedom has played out in the contemporary art movement of Azerbaijan. I would like to introduce you to our host for this salon, Mrs. Barbara Tober, Chairman Emeritus of the Museum of Arts and Design in New York. Barbara is a lifelong patron of the arts and has helped many artists with their careers. For over 30 years, she was the editor-in-chief of Brides magazine in New York and has traveled every corner of the world and collected art along the way. We are delighted that Barbara has joined us to introduce our two guest speakers. Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very, very much. I am so happy, April, to be here today because we have two fabulous speakers. And a welcome to our international audience and the two speakers who are going to make you very, very happy that you're here. Leslie Gray is a Dubai-based curator and researcher specializing in contemporary art and museums in the Arabian Gulf and Caspian Sea regions through her work and with the advisory firm Baker Langham. In 2019, she finished her PhD in museum studies from the University College London, and focusing on contemporary practice in the GCC and Caspian Sea regions, and has research background in anthropology, contemporary art museum studies, and Islamic art history. In addition to her professional curatorial projects, she has contributed to Art Asia Pacific magazine, very important, and Art Asia Pacific Almanacs 2016 to 2020, and collaborates on curatorial and writing projects in Baku. She has recently completed a forthcoming book on contemporary art in Azerbaijan in partnership with Varvax and the Azerbaijan Tourist Board. Afsana Tahirova is the founder and managing director of Caspia Contemporary, a project established in London with the aim to bring exceptional works of art influenced by culture and history of Azerbaijan to the global art world. Afsana has over 10 years of regional and international management expertise and an MBA degree from London Business School. Coming from a family of art lovers, her passion for art and cultural heritage of her country was matched with her extensive business experience to launch Caspia Contemporary. She is a guest lecturer at Sotheby's Institute of Art and a winner of the Exceptional Talent Visa endorsed by the Arts Council of England, which is an emerging leader in the field of the arts. Our discussion today sets the stage for liberation and transformation in contemporary art in Azerbaijan. I'm looking forward to a lively discussion on the dynamic revival of artist expression in the post-Soviet era, linking contemporary Azerbaijani art and with its ancient roots and what can be described as a journey of the soul. Leslie will share research from her important new book entitled Azerbaijan, a Contemporary Art, and Afsana will take us through the journey of underground artists during the Soviet era. Very interesting. Share her personal experience with the transition to independence and describe what it has been like for artists following the disappearance of repression. Holy, yes. What it has been like for artists following the disappearance of repression to work on new supported environment of diverse artistic expression. It's headed in the right direction, openness. Now I would like to hand it over to you two ladies.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Barbara. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you really to the Azerbaijan Tourism Board and to Broach Associates for having us here today. As Barbara mentioned, I've just completed a book on the contemporary art of Azerbaijan in partnership with the Azerbaijan Tourism Board. The book, which we hope will be the first of many, was a year and a half in the making and was initiated from a series of articles that I've written to showcase Azerbaijani contemporary art. At that time, my colleagues and I realized that there was not enough research or exposure for the important work that Azerbaijani artists were doing. And we wanted to support them by sharing their story, and thus the book was born. So we're very grateful to the Azerbaijan Tourism Board, who immediately saw the value of this kind of work, and they've been an incredible support and partner through this journey. However, the contemporary art of today was inspired by decades of artistic struggle, resistance, and ultimately perseverance of artists working to push back against the Soviet regime, which effectively controlled Azerbaijan from 1920 until 1990. Their story is crucial to understand as part of a larger movement by artists in Azerbaijan to express their rich history and reclaim their identity, which the Soviets worked very hard to repress. It's important to remember that Azerbaijan has always had a fascinating and dynamic artistic output, and the artists today take inspiration from their past, both in symbolism and mythology of Azerbaijan, but also the desire to express themselves as part of a larger dialogue of liberation following the end of the Soviet Union. I'm honored to be joined here by Afsana Tahirova, an expert on this topic and whose Caspia Contemporary Project showcases Azerbaijani artists to the world. Afsana will take us through the history of the artistic struggle of Azerbaijani artists during Soviet rule and show how liberation transformed artistic production up through the end of the 1990s, setting the scene for Azerbaijani contemporary art today. With that, Afsana.
Thank you. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to be sharing my research and expertise today with you and the participants. Just give me a sec. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the artworks that I will be mentioning today here. Okay. Okay, so yes, today, as Leslie mentioned, we will be talking about Azerbaijani contemporary art, but not just contemporary, we will also be talking about the art in the Soviet times, because there was a massive underground movement during the oppression period that underground movement formed the basis for our contemporary art. So we can't skip it, we have to talk about it when we mention anything about contemporary Azerbaijani art. So I wanted to start this talk by mentioning how often Azerbaijan is called an ex-Soviet state in the international media. And that is a valid description because Soviet Union is a very solid part of our modern history. It affected all parts of life, including arts. But that label in today's world can get a little too sticky because it doesn't take into account how much has changed since the independence. So today we will be talking about what happened in the Soviet times to art and how art and artistic scene has changed after the independence. So I wanted to start by talking about how Soviet Union came into the picture in Azerbaijan and the wider geography and what happened. So Soviet Union occupied the wider geography, including Azerbaijan, in 1920. And how they started was they started to build a new identity, a kind of a unified identity in Azerbaijan and in all other socialistic Soviet republics, which meant that a lot of the times and almost all of the time they chose to override the identity that was already there. And there was an extreme top-down approach to everything, which meant that not much was being absorbed from the bottom. And I'm going to take a tiny side note here, a food for thought before I come back to this. There's a lot of research going on by young researchers from the region on this topic now. But what was happening then was called Soviet Orientalism. As much as the Soviet revolutionary government refused and rejected everything about the Russian Empire, they inherited the territories, but they also inherited the approach of the empire to all the other nations that were part of it, which was, you can draw parallels to Soviet and Russian imperialistic Orientalism with Western colonialism of remaking the backward societies. And that's what was happening with the top-down approach. So this is a bit of a side note of food for thought to think about how the Soviets rejected the Russian Empire, but they kind of inherited some of the concepts and continued with it. So how they were overriding the current identity, they were doing it through propaganda. And one of the posters I'm showing here. And propaganda was done in education, politics, social activities, and of course, in art. This particular propaganda poster is from 1925. It shows two men reading in Latin alphabet, and it shows another man helping them break out of chains, and the chains are Arabic letters. So the artist is supporting the government policy of changing the alphabet from Arabic to Latin, and this way giving a message that the new government will save us from the previous ignorance. So what was art like in the Soviet Union when we talk about them overriding the current identity? Soviet government constructed a new approved art form, which they called socialist realism. So what this means is, first of all, the technique was supposed to be realism, and the content was supposed to be socialism. And the content was supposed to be positive, depicting a bright future for generations to come in the Soviet Union. This was the only art form that was approved by the government. Anything else tried out, explored, applied by the artists was not approved. Not even to mention any protest against the government, this was totally rejected. And before I move into the disapproved art, because when you start oppressing any society, any group, it creates an underground movement where humans continue to explore and to create the way they want to. So this oppression did create an underground artistic movement in Azerbaijan. But before I move into showing you the pieces from that movement, I want to show you what socialist realism looked like. This is an example of a socialist realist painting, Women of Afsharon by Tahir Salahov. He's a really well-known artist from Azerbaijan. So I don't like comparing socialist realism to other art forms, because the artists that created in socialist realism are equally valuable for our history. That's why I've included Tahir Salahov. Two of his paintings here. You see an oil worker here, happy. There's birds flying. It shows the sun is shining. It shows a bright a present and a bright future. This one by Mikhail Abdullayev, Women Working in the Fields. So these are the examples, some examples of socialist realism. But then comes an underground movement that rejects this government policy. And what happens is the government starts ostracizing those artists. The government calls them unofficial artists. They're called friends of the West. They're called enemies of the nation. But the artists persevere against all odds. Some of the artists are even prosecuted, but they still continue creating the way their soul calls them to create. One of the first artists I wanted to mention here from that era, from the disapproved movement, is Ashraf Murad. I'll give you a little bit of his life story here. He had a mysterious clash with the Soviet police. He was detained. He was beaten up in detainment, after which he suffered severe physical damage. But sadly, he suffered a lot worse of a psychological injury after that encounter. And from that moment on, his art and his style changed fully. He introduced dark colors into his art. The backgrounds of his art are always dark. And this was his way of rejecting the regime, protesting against it. This particular painting is called Sportswoman, but it differs greatly from the happy sports people of the era. This sportswoman is geometrical, dark, but non-linear. And I like to mention how Ashraf's art is non-linear because linear art is associated with Soviet art, especially if you look at the architecture. Straight lines, straight buildings, tall, straight buildings. So non-linear art in Ashraf's paintings is a protest to the Soviet regime. And you look at the sportswoman here, she's antisocial. She doesn't want you to look at her. She doesn't want to be viewed. Some of his art is indirect protests to the Soviet regime, but there are paintings that are direct protests to the oppression. For example, this one is Lenin in Smolny. And a woman is writing down a decree that Lenin is reciting. And if you look closely, Lenin's fingertips are red. Maybe these are representatives of blood. We don't know. There's another painting, which is also a very direct protest to the regime, is called Voting. There's a man voting here. At the backdrop, there's the painting of Stalin. And on the other side is a policeman watching the man vote. So unfortunately, what happened to Ashraf is he died alone in his apartment. The person who moved into his apartment after his death took out all of his works and threw them out into the garbage. Some of them were even burnt. But thank God to some of his friends and sympathizers at the time, some of the works were saved, and this is what we have now. There was a really good exhibition organized by Yarat Contemporary Art Space in Azerbaijan in 2019, dedicated to the retrospective art of Ashraf Murad. It was a solo exhibition. The other two artists I wanted to mention are two brothers, Javadov brothers. Their style is also unofficial. There you go. Mirjavad Javadov and Tofik Javadov.
And Afsana, this is quite an interesting piece, actually. Could you give us a little bit of background on this artist and how he kind of broke out of the mold to start creating work like this?
So Mirjavad has an interesting life story as well. In most of these artists' lives, something happens that they stop conforming. So what happened in Mirjavad's life is he bumped into Cézanne's catalog in Azerbaijan. He was quite fascinated by the works. And when he traveled to St. Petersburg for school, he went to the Hermitage Museum and demanded and even threatened the staff that they show him the originals of Cézanne. And although the entire collection of post-impressionists were available in Hermitage, inherited from the Russian imperialistic times, during the Soviet times, they weren't allowed to be part of the permanent exhibition. Yet Mirjavad was one of the few artists who actually could get access to the originals because he was so demanding to the staff. And after he viewed originals of post-impressionists, something changed. He then visited a Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography in St. Petersburg, and he was introduced to folk art and tribal art from Africa, Indonesia, Oceania, Middle East. And this struck him really, really powerfully and got him connected to Azerbaijani folk art and Azerbaijani mythological art. So he came back to Azerbaijan and started creating these works with very vivid colors and mythological characters from Azerbaijani folktales and the other tribal art that he was impressed by. And his works are quite grotesque sometimes. And we believe the grotesqueness is a protest to the regime that was trying to tell him what to paint and how to paint. His brother, Tofik Javadov, was also an artist.
And Afsana, this is actually quite an interesting work because here I believe this is a painting of oil workers and quite a contrast to what you showed us earlier during the socialist realism era. Very different kind of color and expression on these artists. Could you explain that a little bit and his practice?
Mm-hmm. Well, Tofik Javadov is a very interesting artist to me personally because compared to his brother, Mirjavad rejected the content of socialist realism and the technique completely. What Tofik Javadov did, he kind of took in the socialist content, but filtered it through his own artistic style. And his socialist content isn't happy, bright future. The oil workers coming back from work here are not very happy. They're tired. They're exhausted. Their faces are dark. The entire painting is a little dark. This other one, I really like this one, is an industrial themed painting. But what I like about it is how extremely small humans are on the left-hand side, how small individuals became in the face of the Soviet regime and Soviet top-down approach and industrialization.
And this is also quite interesting because, you know, there was a parallel movement in Europe of artists like Giorgio Chirico, who were kind of applying these surrealist aesthetics and saturated colors to industrial landscapes. But clearly within this work, you can see the critique of the socialist realism idealization of industry and labor very clearly. You know, the industrial landscape here is almost like a fever dream or even a nightmare with these kinds of colors and shapes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what I have to mention here is that all these artists, not just these two brothers, but there were several artists of the unofficial art movement, they mostly lived and created in Absheron Peninsula along the Caspian Sea coast. And slowly they started navigating towards each other, learning from each other, sharing, creating together. And this formed a community of Absheron artists. And at the time, they were called Absheronchu, the artists from Absheron, which in Soviet times was a bit of an offensive term. But later during independence, this transformed itself into Absheron School of Painting. And we are so grateful that they existed, that they got together, that they created these works, because later during the independence, the contemporary Azerbaijani art was built on the foundation of what happened then. Soviet regime didn't just restrict art, politics, education, they also restricted everyday life. So this painting is dedicated to holiday Novruz. And Novruz is a celebration of spring equinox day. The holiday dates back to ancient Zoroastrianism, the new year in the Zoroastrian calendar. And today, and at the time as well, today it is celebrated across the region in Azerbaijan, Afghanistan, Iran, Central Asia, Turkey. But during the Soviet times, although not officially banned, the holiday was discouraged. So it wasn't part of the public holidays list. and it wasn't celebrated in the country publicly until 1969. And when it started being celebrated in 1969, it was called a spring holiday. But what the artists were doing at the time, they were putting Novruz traditions and customs onto the canvas. And Sattar Behlulzadeh, one of the greatest Azerbaijani painters of that time, a very powerful impressionist painter, he created a series of 3 Novruz paintings from 1969 to 1973. This one is called Khoncha. Khoncha is a holiday tray of Novruz. It usually has painted eggs, pastries from the celebration, symbolizing the sun, the moon, the stars, candles around, connecting to the Zoroastrian fire concept. So this Khoncha is Settar's first one from the series. And interesting information about this particular painting is it was immediately acquired by National Museum of Art, the local stuff at the time. And there's speculation that they did it to preserve the painting so it's not seized. Another one, the last one from the series is Azerbaijani Fairy Tale. This is one of my favorite paintings by Sattar. It is in the National Museum of Art. It's part of the permanent collection, but not in permanent display. It's kept in a separate room. You see holiday trays here. You see women at the background celebrating. You see carpets on top. And all of this is becoming a union with the nature. So if you go to the National Museum of Art, do ask the staff to show you this particular painting. If you ask them, they will take you to the room where it is. And Sattar Behlulzadeh himself was creating in isolation as well. He was a kind of a maverick. He didn't sell a single work during his lifetime. He only gifted his works, but his legacy is a very important one for us, and especially for young Azerbaijani artists to come after him. This is Sattar as well, pomegranates. I put this painting here because pomegranate is such an important part of Azerbaijani art. It's been taken in and described by several painters, several artists, in photo, in video, on the canvas, because it's such an important symbol of abundance in Azerbaijan. And keeping on the theme of pomegranates, I wanted to move to the last artist from the series of the Soviet time that I've included here, Toghro Narimanbeyov. Why I included him to the last part of the Soviet time? Because to me, he is an artist on the crossroads of socialist realism and his unique style. Because in the beginning of his career, he did create in the socialist realism style with a gist of his own techniques. But then he abandoned it, and I'll talk about it, and moved fully to his own style. He's also, to me, is a bridge between Soviet art and contemporary Azerbaijani art because he was active in both periods. He was active in the 60s, 70s, 80s, but also continued to paint until his death in the 90s and early 2000s.
And Afsana, if we could just focus on this painting a little bit, because it's so interesting. As you mentioned, the artist was a socialist realist painter. And then you look at this work as he's beginning to move away from that, and you see the incredible lushness of the brush strokes, of the colors, the expressiveness of the women that he paints, the way that he weaves different kind of symbols of Azerbaijan into this work. Could you speak a little bit more about how he kind of moved away really through his aesthetics and even moving into the way that he's showing national symbols and the people of Azerbaijan in particular?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's an interesting story about Toghro. In the early 1960s, he created a large painting dedicated to a socialist theme, which became part of a group exhibition in Baku. But right before the exhibition, government art commission, a representative of the government art commission came in, looked at the painting and said, no, this doesn't align with the government policy, take it away. And he was so incredibly offended and angry at how someone who is not an expert in art, who is a government official, comes in and dictates to him what he should paint and how he should paint, he comes home angry, resentful, upset, and he says, what am I even doing? Why am I even using these things? And he moves away from socialist content from that moment on and dedicates his art fully to Azerbaijani themes, to landscapes, to national symbolisms, to folk art. And pomegranates, and when you talk about Toghrul, pomegranates do come to mind because his pomegranates are very prominent in Azerbaijan. And pomegranate in Azerbaijani art and in Azerbaijani ancient folklore as well is a sign of abundance. It's a sign of abundance across cultures. It is even said that a royal crown in many cultures was inspired by the top of the pomegranate. And for Toghrul, in a lot of cases, pomegranate was not just a sign of abundance, but it was also the sign of undisclosed secretive beauty that you open up and hundreds of seeds show up. And he also has these female characters in the background a lot in his paintings, and these are fairies from Azerbaijani folk tales. There's also another interesting turning point in Toghrul's career when the Soviet government just let him be. And this was the time when, in early 1960s, he creates this particular painting, and you see a little girl with a pomegranate in her hands, again on the left-hand side. He creates this painting. It becomes part of the exhibition in Moscow. French culture minister at the time visits Moscow, looks at this painting, and says, "This is amazing. I have to meet this artist." The culture minister at the time was Andrei Malraux. He comes to Azerbaijan, comes to Baku, meets Toghrul personally, and after that, as Toghrul becomes more prominent outside of Azerbaijan and the Soviet Union, the Soviet government's oppression eases. So they kind of let him be. And this wasn't because they were scared or they couldn't do it anymore, but this was because they kind of used this case to showcase to the world that we're actually not oppressive. Artists are free and can do whatever they want. So Toghrul then travels abroad a lot, lives in several countries, in Europe, in the US, creates there. He is collected by many, many private collectors around the world, and that continues to inspire him. So he is quite active in the 90s and early 2000s. And this is his painting from early 2000s, the city of Baku. And you see his vibrant style, the spirals, you see the fairy at the background again, and you see the architecture of Baku here. Finishing with Toghrul in the Soviet era, then comes 1991, and the system just collapses. And I wanted to symbolize this particular era with the British photographer Rebecca Bathory's painting, photos. Leslie, did you want to say something?
Yes, I just wanted
saw you unmuted.
Yes, I know that you're headed in this direction, but this must have been an incredibly traumatic moment in Azerbaijan. So I just think it's important to hear some more from you about what happened to the country and to the people, as well as a bit of your own experience during this time.
Mm-hmm. So what happened was similar to death. A whole system died. And a few years later, a new stable system was going to be born. But those few years in between death and rebirth were years of turmoil, tragedy, unemployment, poverty, economic downturn. Everything just went down all of a sudden in the country. Socially, economically, politically, on top of all of this, on top of the panic, the uncertainty, the tragedy, there was the war with Armenia, because Armenia attacked Karabakh and occupied Karabakh and 7 surrounding regions. And this added to the tragedy of the collapse of a whole system. For me personally, I went to school in 1991. As a child, I didn't understand. I was 6 years old, and I didn't understand that a government system had collapsed. But I was witnessing panic around me. I was witnessing family members lose their jobs. I was witnessing stress, depression, uncertainty. I met my first internally displaced friend at school in 1992. She came from Karabakh, and it was quite shocking to me that a family had lost everything they had and had to restart a new life in Baku after leaving everything behind because a neighboring country came in and took all they had. I experienced my first funeral because my father's cousin died in the war. So with all of this tragedy going on, I have to mention that there was no space or energy around me or in my family or at school for art. At the time, this was the time where we didn't go to art exhibitions. We didn't talk about art because we were in the survival mode. And that's why I put these two photos by Rebecca here. This is an abandoned building in Russia from the Soviet times. And there are sentences on the background that says, "One nation, one party. Victory is here." This is another abandoned building in Latvia. And it says, "The victory starts here." And it shows the decay of the system before we come back and stabilize the life and the society is reborn again. For me,
So
Leslie?
sorry to jump in, but you just mentioned that, as you said, there wasn't a lot of space emotionally, culturally, socially for art. And so this certainly must have, as it affected every single person in Azerbaijan and their friends and family, of course it affected the artists. So it would be interesting to know at what point did that begin to emerge again, after the war and as Azerbaijan began to move on from that moment.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to mention here that the artists never stopped. Whatever happens in the world, artists don't stop self-expressing, and they never stopped self-expressing in Azerbaijan either. It's just that we were so much in the survival mode that the public and the artists didn't engage at the time. But at the time, from 1990, 1991, all the way to 1994, when things started stabilizing, the artists were creating their works. There were a lot of works on Karabakh War. There was an exhibition at the time, which I know now of, an exhibition dedicated to Khojaly massacre, which happened in 1993, February. There were works of self-exploration. There were works where artists were trying to heal the society. I'm not going to focus on those few years and on art from those years because there is a really nice exhibition going on in Yarat, organized by Yarat Contemporary Art Space right now. The exhibition will be on until 30th of May this year. You don't have to visit the exhibition hall. You can click on the link to the exhibition, which will be shared on the chat here. And on the bottom of the exhibition link, there is a 3D exhibition tour that you can take to view all the artworks that are being shared. So I would recommend you don't miss that exhibition. So for me, that period is symbolized. This painting is a good way to express that period by Mousseï Amirov. It is called A Flash of Intuition. And for me personally, who has lived through that, this painting is about going within, like whatever happens around you, hold on to who you are, even if it looks like the aliens are coming in to take you and your identity away, stick to who you are. So this, after things started stabilizing, after there was the ceasefire, after oil contracts were signed and the economy started recovering, the artists, from my view, started experimenting not just with a variety of artistic techniques, which they weren't able to do in the Soviet times, but they also started going within and exploring their individual and our collective identity. And that's why here I wanted to mention one of the artists that I really like, and I represented this artist in London. His name is Haji Mirza Fatzaliyev. For me, he's a symbol of reconnecting to pre-Soviet roots. He reconnected to Azerbaijani mythology. Here, this particular painting is called Div. Div is an Azerbaijani um, mythological character that is an evil force in the fairy tales. Div is connected to Zoroastrian Dayeva. Dayeva is, in the Zoroastrian texts in Avesta, are evil forces that spread chaos and disorder. And Azerbaijani folklore and mythology has taken that evil force from Zoroastrianism and tamed it. So it's not as powerful and strong and horrendous as it is in the Zoroastrian texts. It's a tamed evil character that is trying to break happiness, break joy. But here in this particular painting, the child is holding on the light to the div and not letting him come near. In Haji Mirza's paintings, children are often a sign of purity. It's not just mythology in his art, it's also religion. I really like that aspect about Haji Mirza, that he did go back to the pre-Soviet roots a lot. This particular painting, he shows the union of Islam and Zoroastrianism, Islam with a camel and its five-fingered paw, and Zoroastrianism with the candles on the camel. And here he shows a man upset like this, and because he's disconnected from his soul, from his spiritual journey, and angels are trying to wake him up and to bring him back to spirituality. And this is, in a way, a subconscious message to the Soviet era, where any form of religious practice was banned. And continuing on the idea of religion, I also included Gayur Yunus here, who is a very interesting artist in contemporary Azerbaijani art who was active in the 90s and early 2000s.
Yes, you can see here very clearly that he does take his inspiration from an earlier period of Azerbaijani history, specifically the Qajar dynasty and the kind of paintings that came out of that moment. You can see the iconography very clearly in the expressive eyes, the way that the faces are painted. But he has a really interesting contemporary sensibility that he layers into this. And I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you're right. Gayur Yunus is very much inspired by Qajar art. And Qajar dynasty ruled Persia from around 1781 to 1925. And Azerbaijanis feel a connection to Qajar period and Qajar art because Qajar dynasty was also a Turkic dynasty, so there is an ethnic connection between Azerbaijanis and Qajar period. And I want to mention here how Qajar art differed from the art in Persia that came before Qajar dynasty. So during the Qajar art times, there was a powerful movement in Europe that was happening. There was oil and canvases became very prominent, portraiture, Rembrandt, Rubens, they became very powerful in the movement, and that affected art in Persia. And slowly, the art in Persia started moving from miniature, from the stories, from the happenings to, excuse me, to people, to their faces, to their bodies, to their individualities. And that's what happened in Qajar art. There's a lot of Qajar royal family portraits from that period, and Gayur Yunus is definitely inspired by them. But he brings in his own Azerbaijani motives here. He depicts women a lot in his paintings in Qajar artistic style, but there are women, there are children. On the background, you often see flowers, birds, hares, like you see a pear in child's hand here. You see religious context, Islamic context. So he uses Quranic inscriptions on his paintings a lot. And he sometimes inscribes his name in Arabic letters. This is his way of saying that these women are from Azerbaijan, they are Muslim, and I am Muslim, and I'm very proud of it. And I really like this idea in the face of what's happening globally around the world, that racism is being challenged and Islamophobia is being challenged. And these artists are a way to give a message to the world that don't be judgmental or scared of that which you don't know and which you don't understand. Moving on from Gayu to late 90s and early 2000s, now the artistic scene in Azerbaijan starts to become more dynamic. So we're moving from self-exploration to the outward expression of not just ourselves, but we are starting to interact with the world outside. And the artists are starting to challenge the status quo. They are starting to challenge the taboos. And this is when the first signs of conceptual art is born. And that's why I wanted to end this talk with Sabina Sheklinskaya, because she's one of the pioneers of conceptual Azerbaijani art, contemporary conceptual Azerbaijani art.
Yes, and you can really see how she has completely moved away from any kind of figuration here. So it's quite a shift from what we've seen with the other artists who were kind of experimenting with different ways of showing figures and showing identity, mythology, folklore. And here you have this really expressive, vibrant red canvas with a lot of dynamism and movement, but no kind of discernible figure. It's something quite different than anything that has come before it. And I know that she was part of a group of artists who were moving away, but she has such an amount of power that she puts on the canvas and kind of confronts us with. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this work.
Yes, this is a work from her series Dangerous Red. Before I come to Dangerous Red, I want to mention that Sabina did found an artistic collective called Labyrinth and brought together around 10, 12 artists where they started expressing themselves in a conceptual manner. For example, they toured Baku, they collected bits and pieces from abandoned buildings, equipment, shipwrecks, etc., and created an exhibition out of them, kind of grieving and protesting against the decay of old Baku. She also did a nice work. Unfortunately, I couldn't find it, so I couldn't share it here, but she did a really nice work, 7 Burning Doors, as a tribute to Zoroastrianism. And Dangerous Red is a very interesting one to me personally, because it is a project where she protests against violence and war. And the next painting I'm going to show, I need to warn the audience that it has bits and pieces of slaughtered animals. So if you're disturbed by that, please put your screen down, and I will tell you once I move on from that painting so you can turn your screen up again. So I'm going to move to that painting, that photo now. Sabina works across several mediums. She works on canvas, she does photographs, she does video, she does land art, and this particular one is her way of protesting against violence and giving a message that, here you see pomegranates, right? You see watermelons. And we've been talking about pomegranates in Sattar's art, in Tokrul's art, and how it's a beautiful symbol of abundance. But here, it's a symbol of violence and blood and war. And she's trying to give a message that harmony and quietness can be turned into chaos and violence if it comes in contact with humans. So here, a beautiful symbol of abundance comes in contact with human nature, and if that nature is violent, it can turn into something that's blood and violence.
And again, to speak about how contemporary art is emerging at this time, I mean, now we're looking at a piece of photography that is taking these symbols and kind of expressing them in a very different way through a very different medium. And, Sabina has been such an immensely influential artist in Azerbaijan, both with her peers and also with the younger generation. And I think you can see in this work in particular how that influence has kind of, cascaded out through the next generation because of the way that she is willing to take risks and to be really bold in what she says, and to be brave to put this in front of people and encourage them to have dialogue and to think about the symbolism, the color, and what all of this means within the larger society. So this is an incredible piece, I believe, to showcase here and to think about as we continue on. So again, thank you. I mean, it's really fitting here to end with Sabina. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to say, Afsana, or I'll just.
This is the end of the talk, and I just wanted to mention that Sabina and the other artists who were conceptual and not subtle in the way they were expressing themselves and protesting against the status quo, they paved the way to a generation of young artists who were even more brave and more direct with the way they were interacting with the outside world. But that is a topic for part 2. So I'm not going to go into that too much. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Afsana. That was a truly fascinating journey. Thank you so much. That sets us up nicely for our next discussion.
Mhm.
Okay, I think we're ready to go to the floor.
Yes. So I think we'll go to a Q&A now. And Elizabeth, you have some, and we've got a wonderful question from Barbara Tober.
Yes. Well, shall I ask it now? I
Yeah.
will.
Barbara, before you begin, Afsana, perfect. That's just what I was going to say. All right, Barbara, we're ready for you now.
So first of all,
And for those, I'm so sorry to interrupt, for those who turn their screens off because the image could have been disturbing, I've now stopped sharing the screen so you can plug back in.
I think we need to see art, whether it's disturbing or not. In any event, what are the most pervasive influences now? Is it nature? I mean, you had a little of each in this. Nature or anthropology, the way people live, the expertise of the brushstrokes and the ability to paint has been extraordinary in this talk of yours. I mean, it's very, very impressive work, just over all in all. But as we go forward, do you see that these, what are these influences that are going to be more all pervasive? Afsana.
Well, definitely anthropology. Definitely, I see in contemporary Azerbaijani art, I see people, their stories, their feelings, their challenges, and I definitely see it moving away from the nature a lot, especially with young artists who are also moving away from the canvas to the other mediums, to performance, to video, to installations. So definitely anthropology. If Leslie wanted to add something.
Yeah, I would echo that as well. Exactly what Afsana said. The younger generation of artists have really taken what their forefathers and foremothers have done and kind of exploded it out into all different kind of media, and are really in search of ways to express themselves, not only their kind of social and cultural identity, but their identity as young people now. So, part of a larger global dialogue as well. So thinking about what it is to be, not only Azerbaijani, but to be part of a larger global discourse. And that takes the form of a lot of different types of art. And I think that the young artists, much like the people who came before them, are really pushing the boundaries of what you can do with art. Through things like installation, performance, filmmaking, carpets. There are so many different ways that artists are thinking about who they are and the stories that they want to tell.
Good. Expansion is important.
Wonderful.
I think Rowdy.
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I can speak on behalf of the chats that have been coming in to our panelists and on the Q&A, and we have so much interest from our guests. I have promised one of our guests that we would send a quick recap of some of the key artists, Afsana and Leslie, that you have mentioned today. And so I just wanted to put that offer to any of our guests on today's Salon. If you would like to receive a quick follow-up with some of those names to follow, then you're more than welcome to leave your email in the chat, and we will follow up with you there. So please do not hesitate to get in touch. On that particular note, Afsana, I'm going to come to you first, and then Leslie, I'll come to you with a question. I'm recapping some of the questions that have been coming in and bundling them for you. So one of the questions, Afsana, is can you just help our guests understand, first of all, what can be done to promote the art scene in Azerbaijan. So many people are so inspired by what they've heard from you and seen from you. So what can stakeholders that are interested in encouraging local artists do to promote that scene? And if there are any artists or curators that you haven't yet talked about today that you encourage us to start following, artists or curators that are ones to watch from Azerbaijan, we would appreciate hearing from you about that as well.
Okay, so well, we will be talking about how Azerbaijani art is venturing out into the international scene in our part 2. So I would recommend that all those who ask this question join our part 2 as well. So how you promote Azerbaijani art outside of Azerbaijan is through collaborations, through art fairs. Collaborations with major museums are an important way to showcase the art to people outside of Azerbaijan, anywhere else in the world. Before the pandemic hit, we were going to have a few projects, and one of them was going to be with a museum in Shanghai, because they were interested in, as they're doing their One Belt, One Road project, they were interested in art from the region, including Central Asia and Azerbaijan. So this was going to be one of the ways of bringing Azerbaijani art outside of Azerbaijan and outside of Europe, where Azerbaijani art ventures a lot into. So this is what I think, like art fairs, museums, projects with international other artists, not just Azerbaijani artists, but projects of Azerbaijani artists with international artists. We did have projects, not my projects, but we do have interesting music festivals going on. Like we have Alim Gasimov, who's a major mugham singer. Mugham is a traditional Azerbaijani music. We have his projects with various international dance groups, singers brought together and showcased in London, in New York, and it brings a lot of attention, and it looks beautiful, it sounds beautiful. So this is what I think, venturing out. And if Leslie wanted to add something to that, or if Leslie wanted to mention any of the curators that she recommends that we follow.
Sure.
She's more in young contemporary art space.
Yes, so I do do a bit of work with the kind of emerging artists of Azerbaijan, and I work with platforms like Baryok and Tardino 6 to support, artists both within Azerbaijan and also outside of Azerbaijan. So I would recommend, Sabina is an amazing curator, Sabina Shiklinskaya. She is an artist but has a phenomenal curatorial practice. Asli Samadova is also a curator who is kind of up and coming and becoming much more well-known, especially internationally. And Jahangir Selimkhanov, who has been involved with the art scene in Azerbaijan from, I would say, I guess the late 90s and onward, supporting young and emerging artists. And then there are some other up and coming curators who are working with institutions like Yarat. So there's quite a lot of talent in the country, and a lot more people who will, I think, be making names for themselves in the years to come. As far as artists are concerned, I think it's hard to only name a few, but I'll try. Of course, Vaig Ahmed, he's very famous for the carpet artworks that he does. Orhan Husseinov, who's also well-known internationally. He works a lot in film and plexiglass. Farhad Farzaliev, he's also an artist to watch who does all types of kind of musical installations, and he paints and he makes films. And a personal favorite of mine is Samir Salakov. So also Nazreen Mamadova. I could go on and on and on. I would recommend for people who are interested, look on Instagram for Azerbaijani artists. You'll find them because they have a strong presence. So I challenge you to just go out there and try to find them. And of course, Sitara Ibrahimova, a wonderful photographer, really pushing all of the boundaries of photography. And you can definitely find her. She has new works out, new video works. So I recommend you check them out.
Oh, I just wanted to add one more thing. First of all, do follow Yarat Contemporary Art Space. They do, so I just wrote it down in the chat. Yarat Contemporary Art Space, they do projects of Azerbaijani artists with international artists, so it's a good union. But also, if you want to know more about contemporary Azerbaijani art, definitely follow Azerbaijan Pavilion in the Venice Biennale. There's some great curatorial work and some great projects that happen there. We've had our fourth pavilion in Venice Biennale in 2019. And I'm hoping that once the pandemic is over and we go back to the active art space, we will go back to the pavilion.
Well, thank you so much. And a good reminder for us to hop on Instagram during this time that we cannot travel as much as we'd like to Baku or to other cities that feature the art of Azerbaijan. We can at least travel through our phones and admire all of the beautiful work that you're discussing here. So thank you for giving us that window. We are running up against the clock. I'll just ask one more very quick question, which is, we have some of our attendees are curious about other influences from, for example, the French art scene or other countries that have over time influenced Azerbaijani art. Can either of you two just help our guests understand a few of those influences, and then I'll have to hand back over to April to wrap us up today.
Well, yes, there was an influence of global art on Azerbaijan starting from the independence, but also the Soviet strict policies eased up in early 80s and towards the end of the 80s. This was the time of perestroika, and this was the time of putting down the Iron Curtain and venturing out into the world. So that's when the artists were now free to educate themselves in all the other movements around the world, but also to travel and exhibit outside of Azerbaijan. So there was definitely an influence from European art, and it continues to be. And even now in Azerbaijani art schools and art universities, it's part of the artistic education. The European art schools of various eras are part of the textbooks. So yes, there definitely is. So I can't mention one movement because all of them have various influences on various artists.
Thank you so much. Leslie, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't. That was perfect. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, Barbara, Leslie, and Afsana, thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to April to wrap us up. Thank you for bringing us into your world as guests of the Azerbaijani contemporary art scene today.
April, you need to unmute yourself, sorry.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. That'll help. Thanks. So I want to thank Barbara, my dear friend Barbara Tober, for her involvement today and for hosting our discussion, and especially to our two distinguished speakers, to Afsana Tahirova and Leslie Gray, who've done a masterful job. And a huge thanks to our audience for joining us today on UNESCO World Art Day. And you heard that we are planning a part 2, and the date is Thursday, April 29th, so exactly 2 weeks from now. So you'll receive more information about that. And this will be our sequel, and a fascinating discussion taking us forward from the time that Afsana left off to what's happening today in the contemporary art scene in Azerbaijan. So thank you so much, and until the next time, bye-bye.